started happening. So yeah, we're going to the past right now. So this should be interesting. We'll start with Egypt here soon. And I'll read one paragraph before that because I just read it. It seems like it'd be a good paragraph to go over. All right, I'm gonna the music. It might sound weird doing this, but you know. And everybody, if you can, do not do my life goal. Make sure you give to the refugees first. My life goal is only there to, I don't know what it does, honestly. All right, let's get started. And this is the paragraph before. Again, it must be emphasized that a survey of the scene in Africa before the coming of Europeans would reveal considering unevenness of development. There were social formations representing hunting, hands, communalism, feudalism, and many positions intermediate between the last two. The remainder of this section will be devoted to a review of the principal features of several of the most developed societies and states of Africa in the last 1,000 years or so before Africa came into permanent contact with Europe. The areas to be considered are Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, Morocco, the West Sudan, the interlacustrine zone of East Africa, Zimbabwe. Each serves as an example of what development meant in earlier Africa and what the direction of social movement was. To a greater or lesser extent, each was also a leading force on the continent in the sense of carrying neighbors along the same path, either by absorbing them or influencing them more indirectly. Some concrete examples. Let's start with Egypt. Egypt. It is logical to start with Egypt as the oldest culture in Africa, which rose to eminence. Yeah. The glories of Egypt under the pharaohs are well known and do not need recounting. At one time, it used to be said or assumed that ancient Egypt was not African. A curious view which is no longer seriously propounded. However, for the present purposes, it is more relevant to refer to Egypt under Arab and Turkish rule from the 7th century onwards. During the later period, the ruling class was foreign, and that meant that Egypt's internal development was tied up with other countries, notably Arabia and Turkey. Colonized Egypt sent abroad great amounts of wealth in the form of food and revenue, and that was a very negative factor. But the tendency was for the ruling foreigners to break with their own imperial masters and to act simply as a ruling elite within Egypt, which became an independent feudal state. One of the first features of feudalism to arrive in Egypt was the military aspects. The Arab and Turkish and Circassian invaders were all militarily inclined. This was particularly true of the Mullahs, who held power from the 13th century onwards. Political power in Egypt from the 17th century lay in the hands of a military oligarch, which delegated the actual government to bureaucrats, thereby creating a situation similar to that of places like China and Indochina. Even more fundamental was the fact that land tenure relations were undergoing change in such a way that a true feudal class came on the scene. All the conquerors made land grants to their followers and military captains. Initially, the land in Egypt was the property of the state to the to be rented out to cultivators. The state then had the right to reappropriate the land and allocate it once more, somewhat like the head of a village community acting as the guardian of the land to related families. However, the ruling military element also became a new class of landowners. By the 15th century, most of the land in Egypt was the property of a sultan and his military lords. If there was a small class which monopolized most of the land, it followed that there was a large class of the landless. Peasant cultivators were soon converted into mere agricultural laborers, tied to the soil as tenants or vassals of the feudal landlords. These peasants, with little or no land, were known as the felon. In Europe, there are, and they're going back to Europe. In Europe, there are legends about the exploitations of suffering of the Russian serf, or the Munchkin. I can't say it. Muzhik under feudalism. In Egypt, the exploitation of the felon, Fellahin, was carried out even more thoroughly. The feudalists had no interest in the Fellahin beyond seeing that they produced revenue. Most of what that peasants produced was taken from them in the form of tax, and the tax collectors were asked to perform the miracles of taking from the peasants even that which they did not have. When their demands were not met, the peasants were brutalized. The antagonistic nature of the contradiction between the feudal warrior landlords and the felon was revealed by a number of peasant revolts, notably in the earlier part of the 18th century. In no continent was feudalism an epic of romance for the laboring classes, but the elements of development were seen in the technologically and the increase of productive capacity. Under the patrons of a Fatimid dynasty, it was 906 AD to 1170 AD. Science flourished. The industry reached a new level in Egypt. Windmills and water wheels were introduced from Persia in the 10th century. New industries were introduced: paper making, sugar refining, porcelain, and the distillation of gasoline. The older industries of textile, leather, and metal were improved upon. The succeeding dynasties of the Yabins and the Mamluks also achieved a great deal, especially in the building of canals, dam bridges, and aqueducts, and in stimulating commerce with Europe. Egypt at the time was still able to reach Europe many things and was flexible enough to receive new techniques in return. Although feudalism was based on the land, it usually developed towns at the expense of the countryside. The high points of Egypt's feudal culture were associated with towns. The Fatimids founded Cairo, which became one of the most famous and most cultured cities in the world. At the same time, they established the Azhar University, Azhar University, which still exists today as one of the oldest in the world. The feudalists and the rich merchants were the ones who benefited most but the craftsmen and other city dwellers of Cairo and Alexandria were able to participate to some extent in the leisure lives of the town. Ethiopia. I'm going to do something real quick. I'll be right back. I need to go clean my glasses just for real quick. Who's in the guests? I don't know. Jake, we're not doing debates. Hold on a second. Sorry, everybody. Sorry. I had a spot on my glasses that were destroying me right now. Sorry, everybody. Ethiopia, too, at the start of its history, was a great power. Was ruled over by foreigners. The kingdom of Axiom, and one of the most important of the nuclei around which feudal Ethiopia eventually emerged. And Axiom was founded near the Red Sea coast by the dynasty of Sabine origins from the other side of the Red Sea. But the kings of Axiron were never agents of foreign power, and they became completely Africanized. The founding of Axiom goes back to the 1st century AD, and its ruling class was Christianized within a few centuries. After that, they moved inland and participated in the development of the Christian feudal Ethiopian state. The Ethiopians, the Tigrians, and the Emmerich ruling class was a proud one, tracing its descendant to Solomon as the state which incorporated several other smaller states and the kingdoms. It was an empire in the same sense as feudal Austria or Persia. The emperor of Ethiopia was addressed as, quote, the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, elected of God, emperor of Ethiopia, king of kings, end quote. The practice, however, the Solomonic, quote unquote, line was not unbroken. Most of the consolidations of the inland Ethiopian plateau was carried out in the 12th century by intruding dynasty, the Zangwi, who made claims of descent from Moses. The Zagwin kings distinguished themselves by building several churches cut out of solid rock. The agricultural achievements attest to the level of skills reached by Ethiopians, as well as the capacity of the state to mobilize labor on a huge scale. Such tasks could not have been achieved by voluntary family labor, but only through the labor of an exploited class. A greater deal is known of the superstructure of Ethiopian empire, especially its Christianity and its literate culture. History was written to glorify the king and the nobility, especially under the restored, quote, Salamoni, end quote, dynasty, which replaced the Zangwin in 1270 AD. Fine illuminated books and manuscripts became a prominent element in the Aramic culture. Equally fine garments and jewelry were produced for the ruling class and for the church. The top ecclesiastics were part of the nobility, and the institutions of the monastery grew to great proportions in Ethiopia. The association of organized religion with the state was implicit in communal society, where the distinction between politics and economies, religion, medicine are scarcely drawn. Under feudalism everywhere, church and state were the close alliance. The Buddhists were preeminent in feudal Vietnam, Burma, Japan, and, to the lesser extent, in China. In India, a limited Buddhist influence was overwhelmed by that of the Hindus and Muslims. And of course, in feudal Europe, it was the Catholic Church, which played a role parallel to the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia. The wealth of Ethiopia rested on the agricultural base. The fertile uplands supported cereal growing, and there was considerable livestock raising, including the rearing of horses. Craft skills were developed in a number of spheres of foreign craftsmen were encouraged. For instance, earlier in 15th century, the Turkish artisans settled in the country and made coats of mail and weapons for the Ethiopian army. Coptics from Egypt were also introduced to help run the financial administration. No one denies that the word feudal can be applied to Ethiopia in those centuries because there existed a clear-cut class contradiction between the landlords and the peasants. Those relations grew out of communalism that had characterized Ethiopia. Like other parts of Africa much earlier, feudal Ethiopia included lands that were communally owned by village and ethnic communities, as well as lands belonging directly to the crown. But in addition, large territories were conferred by the conquering Amharic dynasties. It's AMHARIC dynasties on members of the royal family and on soldiers and priests. Those who received huge areas of land became Ras, RAS, or provisional princes, and they had judges appointed by their emperor attached to them. The peasants of their domain were reduced to tenants who could earn their living only by offering produce of the landlord and taxes to the state, also in produce. The landlords exempted themselves from tax, a typical situation of feudal societies, and one which fed the fires of revolution in Europe. Then the bourgeoisie class grew powerful enough to challenge the fact that the feudalists were using political power to tax everyone but themselves. Ethiopia, of course, never reached that stage of transition to capitalism. What is clear is that the transition to feudalism has been made. Nuba was another Christian region in Africa, but one which was not so famous as Ethiopia. In the 6th century AD, Christianity was introduced into the Middle Nile, and the district once ruled by the famous state of Kush and Meroe. In the period, as you can tell, I'm changing the page. In the period before the birth of Christ, Kush was a rival to Egypt in splendor, and it ruled Egypt for a number of years. Its decline in the 4th century AD was complete by attacks from then expanded Aksum. The 3 small Nubian nation states which rose some time afterward were to some extent the heirs of Kush, although after their conversion to Christianity, it was the religion which dominated Nubian culture. The Nubian states, which had consolidated to two about the 8th century, achieved most from the 9th to the 11th century, in spite of great pressures from Arabic and Islamic enemies. And they did not finally succumb until the 14th century. Scholarly interest in Nubia was focused on the ruins of large red brick churches and monasteries which had murals of frescoes and fine quality. Several conclusions can be drawn from the material evidence. In the first place, a great deal of labor was required to build those churches, along with the stone fortifications which often surrounded them. As with the pyramids of Egypt or the feudal castles of Europe, the common builders were instantly exploited and probably coerced. Secondly, skilled labor was involved in the making of the bricks and in the architecture. The paintings indicated that the skill surpassed mere manual dexterity, and the same artistic merit was noticeable in the fragments of the painted pottery recovered from Nubia. It has already been indicated that the churches and monasteries played a major role in Ethiopia, and this is worth elaborating on with respects to Nubia. The monastery was a major unit of production. Numerous peasants' huts were clustered around each monastery, which functioned very much as did the manor of the feudal lords. The wealth that accumulated inside the churches were alienated from the peasants, while the finest aspects of the non-material culture, such as books, were accessible only to a small minority. Not only were the peasants illiterate, but in many cases they were non-Christians or only nominal Christians, judging from the better known Ethiopian example of the same date, when the Christian ruling class of Nubia was eliminated by the Muslims. Very little of the achievements of the old state remained in the fabric of the people's daily lives. Such reversal in the historical process are not uncommon throughout human experience. Ultimately, the dialectics of the development asserts itself, but some ebbing and flowing is inevitable. The Nubian states were not in existence in the 15th century, but they constituted a legitimate example of the potentialities of African development. One can go further and discern that Kush was still contributing to African development long after the kingdom had declined and given way to Christian Nubian. It is clear that Kush was a center for which many positive culture elements diffused to the rest of Africa. Brasswork of striking similarities to that of Miro was reproduced in West Africa, and the techniques by which West Africans cast their brass is generally held to have originated in Egypt and to have been passed on by way of Kush. Above all, Kush was one of the earliest and most vigorous centers of iron mining and smelting in Africa. It was certainly one of the sources from which this crucial aspect of technology passes to the rest of the continent. That is why the Middle Nile was the leading force in the social, economic, and political development of Africa as a whole. The Maghreb. I'm probably saying it wrong. The Maghreb. I think it's the Maghreb. I'm not sure. Islam was the great, quote, revealing religion which played the major role in the period of the feudal development of Maghreb. The lands at the western extremities of the Islamic Empire was stretched across Africa, Asia, and Europe within the years of the Prophet Muhammad's death in the 7th century of the Christian era. The Arabic Empire building under the banner of Islam is a classic example of the role of religion in that respect. I can't say his name, Khaldun, a great 14th century North African historian, was of the opinion that Islam was the most important force allowing for Arabic people to transcend the narrow boundaries of small family communities which were constantly struggling among each other. He wrote, this is what he wrote: Arabic pride, touchiness, and intense jealousy of power render it impossible for them to agree. Only then, only when their nature has been permeated. I gotta make sure this word. Sorry, everybody. Where's my thing go? There it is. It's an easy word, but I don't think I'm saying it right. It's like the easy words get me most of the time. Easy words usually get me. As soon as it loads. PERMEAT. All right, let's hear what it says. Please let me hear it. It's a simple word, but I need to hear it.
Permeate.
Permeated by the religious impulse, are they transformed so that the tendency of anarchy is replaced by the spirit of mutual defense. Considering the moment when the religion dominated their policies and led them to observe a religious law designed to promote the moral and material interests of civilization, under a series of successors to the Prophet Muhammad, how vast their empire became and how strong was it established. The above remarks of Ibn Khaldun cover only one aspect of Arabic imperial expansion, but it was certainly a crucial one and attested to the essential roles of ideology in the developmental process that was. And in addition to the material circumstances. Furthermore, in judging the material conditions at any given time, which might form the basis for further expansion of production and further growth of the society's power, it is also necessary to consider the historical legacies like Islamic Egypt and Christian Nubian and Maghreb's of the Islamic dynasties inherited in rich historical and cultural traditions. It was the seat of the famous societies of Carthage, which nourished between 1200 BC to 200 BC, in which was a blend of foreign influence from the Eastern Mediterranean with the Berber people of the Maghreb. The region had subsequently been an important section of the Roman and Byzantine empires. And before becoming Muslim, the Maghreb had actually distinguished itself as the center of nonconformist Christianity, which went under the name of Donatism. Donatism. The striking achievement of Muslim Maghreb were spread over the naval, military, and commercial and cultural spheres. Its navies controlled the Western Mediterranean, and its armies took over most of Portugal and Spain. When the Muslims advanced into Europe, was turned back in the year 732 AD, North African armies were already deep into France. In the 11th century, the armies of, Almoravid dynasty gathered strength from deep within the Senegal and Mauritanian and launched themselves across the Strait of Gibraltar to reinforce Islam in Spain, which has been threatened by Christian kings. Interesting. Hold on a second, looking back just to see. All right, sounds good. Jake is still in the request, don't know why. For over a century, the Almoravid rule in North Africa and Liberia was characterized by commercial wealth and a resplendent literary and architectural record. Before being ejected from Spain in the 2030s, The Maghrib Muslims, or the Moors, as they were called, continued to maintain the dynamic society on African soil. As one index to the standards of social life, it has been pointed out that public baths were common in the cities of Maghrib at a time when, in Oxford, the doctrine was still being propounded that the washing of the body was a dangerous act. That's in Western Europe. One of the most instructive aspects of the history of the Maghrib is the interaction of social formations to produce the state. A major problem that had to be resolved was that of integrating the isolated Berber groups into large political communities. There were also contradictions between sedentary groups and nomadic pastoral sectors of the population. The Berbers were mainly pastoralists, organized in patriarchal clans, and in groups of clans connected by the democratic councils of all adult males. Grazing land was under communal ownership, and maintaining irrigation was also a collective responsibility for the agriculturalist. Yet cooperation, with kin groups contrasts with honest hostilities between those who had no immediate blood ties, and it was only in the face of the Arabic invaders that the Berbers united using a non-conformist Khawarite Islam as their ideology. The Khawarite, which is Kharigite, revolt of 739 AD is considered in one sense as being a nationalistic, and in another sense a revolt of the exploited classes against the Arabic military bureaucratic and theocratic elite who professed the Orthodox Sunni Islam, Sunni. The revolt was the Berber masses laid the basis of Moroccan nationalism. The third centuries later, the Alohand, I can't say this word, Almaoohad dynasty, 1147 and 1270, brought political unity in the whole of Maghreb as a product of the synthesis of Berber and Arabic achievements in the sphere of state building. This is a long one, everybody. Unfortunately, the Maghreb nation did not last, and instead the regions of the bequeathed the nuclei of three nation states: Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Within each of the three areas, the divisive tendencies were very strong in the 14th and 15th century. For instance, in Tunisia, the ruling Hafsid dynasty was constantly involved in crushing local rebellions and defending the integrity of the state. It has been noted already that the political state in Africa and elsewhere was the consequence of development of the productive forces. But the state, in turn, was also conditioned the rate in which the economy advanced, because the two were dialectically interrelated. Therefore, the failure of the Maghreb to build a nation state and the difficulty of consolidating state power, even within the three divisions of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, were factors holding back the further development of the region. Moreover, political division weakened the Maghreb vis-a-vis foreign enemies, and Europe was soon to take advantage of those internal weaknesses by launching attacks from the year 1415 onwards. The experience of the Maghreb can be drawn upon to illustrate the lengthy nature of transition from the one mode of production to another, and the fact that two different ways of organizing society could coexist side by side over centuries. Throughout the period under discussion, a great deal of land in that part of Africa retained its communal ownership and family labor. Meanwhile, considerable socioeconomic stratification had taken place, and antagonistic classes had emerged. At the very bottom of the ladder were the slaves, or the Heretine, who were most often black Africans from south of the Sahara. Then came the Akhemi, or landless peasants, who worked the proprietor's land and gave the latter 4/5 of whatever was produced. Special mention should be made of the position of women, who were not a class by themselves, but who suffered from deprivation at the hands of their own menfolk and of the male-controlled ruling class. Therefore, the women in the Khemi class were in a very depressed condition. At the top of society were the big landowners, who wielded political power along with other devotees of the Muslim region. None of the African society discussed so far can be said to have overthrown up capitalism forms to the point where the accumulation of capital became the principal motive force. However, they all had flourished commercial sectors, moneylenders, and strong handicraft industries, which were the features which ultimately gave birth to modern capitalism through evolution of revolution. The Maghreb merchants were quite wealthy. They gained from the energies of the cultivators, cattlemen, and shepherds. They indirectly or directly mobilized the labor in the mines in copper, lead, antimony, and iron. Antimony. And they appropriated surplus from the skills of craftsmen making textiles, carpets, leather, pottery, and articles of brass and iron. The merchants were a class of accumulators, and their dynamism made itself felt, not only in Maghreb, but also in the Sahara and across the Sahara in West Africa. In that way, the development of Maghreb acted as a factor in the development of what was called Western Sudan. Western Sudan. Just looking back. All right, let's keep going. Western Sudan. To the Arabic people, the whole of Africa south of the Sahara was the Balad as Sudan, Bailad as Sudan, the land of they use the S, but I'll say black people. The name serves today only in the Republic of Sudan on the Nile, but references to the Western Sudan in earlier times concern the zone presently occupied by Senegal, Mali, Upper Volta, Niger, plus parts of Mauritania, Guinea, and Nigeria. The Western Sudanic empires of Ghana, Mali, and Sogahai have become bywords in the struggle to illustrate the achievements of the African past. That is the area to which African nationalists and progressive whites point when they want to prove that Africans too were capable of political, administrative, and military greatness in the epoch before the white man. However, a people's demands at any given time changes the kind of questions to which historians are expected to provide answers. Today, the masses of Africa seek, quote, development, end quote, and total emancipation. The issues that need resolution with regards to Western Sudanic history are those who illumine the principles underlying the oppressive development of certain states in the heart of Africa. The origins of the Empire of Ghana go back to the 5th century AD, but it reaches its peak between the 9th and 11th century. Mali had its prime in the 13th and 14th century. The Songhai in 2 subsequent centuries. The 3 were not in exactly the same location, and the ethnic origins of the 3 ruling classes was different, but they should be regarded as, quote, successor states, end quote, following essentially the same line of evolution and growth. They have been called trading states so often that it is almost forgotten that the principal activity of the population was agriculture. It was a zone in which several species of millet were domesticated, along with the species of rice, several other food plants, and at least one type of cotton. It was a zone which saw the relatively early introductions of iron in the millennia before the birth of Christ, and iron tools exercised their attendant benefits on the agriculture. The open savanna country of Western Sudan also favored livestock. Some groups, such as the Fulunia, were excessively pastoralists, but livestock was to be found in very varying degrees throughout the huge region. Cattle were most significant domesticated animals, followed by goats. The rearing of horses, mules, and donkeys were also carried on, which was made possible by wide free areas. It's to add further variety of the great Niger River allowed for the rise of specialist fishermen. Population, the indispensable factor of production, could only have reached the density which it did because of increasing food supply, while craftsman industries and trade sprang primarily from the products of agriculture. Cotton cultivation led to the making of cotton cloth, with such a variety of specialization that there was internal trade in particular cotton cloth, such as the unbleached fabric of Fute Dijon, Dijon. I can't say that because it's Djallon. And the blue cloth of Denjin. Pastoralism provided a variety of products for manufacture, notably cattle hides and goatskins, which went into the making of sandals, leather jackets for military use, leather pouches and amulets, and so on. Horses served as a means of transport to the ruling class and made a major contribution to welfare and the size of the state. For the purpose of interbreeding, some horses were imported from North Africa, where the Arabic bloodstocks was of the finest qualities. For pack transport, the donkey was, of course, better fitted, and the Mosui kingdom of Upper Volta for a long time specialized in breeding those pack animals which were associated with long distant trade within the vast region. On the edge of the Sahara, the camel took over, another technological quote-unquote asset introduced from the north. Mining was a sphere in which production was important. Some of the royal clans of Western Sudan, such as that of the Kanti, the Kante, were specialist blacksmiths. In a period of expansion by warfare, the control over iron supplies and over iron working skills was obviously decisive. Besides, the two most important articles of long-distance trade was salt and gold, both obtained principally by mining. Neither the salt supply nor the gold supply were originally within the domains of Ghana, but it took steps to integrate them either by trade or by territorial expansion. Ghana struck north into the Sahara and towards the very end of the 10th century. It captured the town of Awindagast from the Berbers, a town useful for the control of the incoming salt mined and in the middle of the desert. Similarly, Mali and Songhai sought to ensure control over, Taghaza, Taghaza, which has the largest single center of salt mining. Songhai took the prize of Teghaze from the desert Berbers and held it for many years in the face of opposition from Morocco. Another crucial but seldom stressed element in the pattern of production was the ownership of copper mines in the Sahara by both Mali and Songhais. What's up, Sebastian? Back of the throat? What are you talking about? I can't do it, sorry. To the south of Ghana laid the important resources of gold on the upper Senegal and its tributary of Felimia. It is said that Ghana obtained its gold by silent or not intelligent barter, which was described as follows. They used the D word, the D-U-M-B word, and here's how it's described. The merchants beat great drums to summon the local natives, who were naked and lived in holes in the ground. From these holes, which were doubtless the pits from which they dug the gold, they refused to emerge in the presence of the foreign merchants. The latter, therefore, used to arrange their trade goods in pile on the riverbank and retire out of sight. The local natives then came and placed the heap of gold beside each pile and withdrew. If the merchants were satisfied, they took the gold and retreated, beating their drums to signify that the market was over. The writer of the above lines, E.W. Boville, a supposed European authority on Western Sudan, then goes on to say that silent trade or drum barter was the feature of Western Sudan's gold trade throughout all of the centuries until modern times. Actually, the only thing not intelligent about the trade is that he writes about it. The story of unintelligent barter for gold in West Africa is repeated in several accounts, starting with ancient Greek scripts. It is clearly a rough approximation of the first attempt at exchange of a people corning into contract with strangers, and it was not a permanent procedure. During the rule of Ghana, the people of two principal goldfields of Bambuk and Born were drawn into regular trade relations with Western Sudan. Ghana probably and Mali certainly exercised political rule over the two regions. where the mining and distribution of gold became a very complicated process. During the centuries of Mali's greatness, extensive mining of gold began in the forests of modern Ghana to supply the trans-Sahara gold trade. The existence of social systems expanded. The strong states emerged to deal with the sale of gold. The merchants who came from the greater cities of the Western Sudan had to buy the gold by weight, using a small accurate measurement known as the BENDA, Benda. When the Portuguese arrived at the river Gambia and got the glimpse of how gold was traded on the upper reaches of the river, they marveled at the dexterity shown by the Mambinga merchants, and later carried very finely balanced scales inlaid with silver and suspended from cords of twisted silk. The gold dust and nuggets were weighed with brass weights. The expertise of the Mandinga in measuring gold and in other forms of commerce was largely due to the fact that within the ethnic group there was a core professional trader, commonly referred to as a Dalas, is Dioulas. They were not very wealthy, but they were distinguished by their willingness to travel thousands of miles from one end of the western Sudan to another. They also reached the coast or very near to the coast of Gambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, and Ghana. The Daluas handled a long list of African products, salt from the Atlantic coast, and the Sahara, cola oil from the forest of Liberia, and Ivory Coast gold from Akan country in modern Ghana, leather from Swaziland, dried fish from the coast, cotton cloth from many districts, and especially from the central areas of Western Sudan, iron from Futa and Dajulan in modern Guinea, shea butter from the upper Gambia, and a host of other local articles. In addition, the trade of Western Sudan involved the circulation of goods orientated in northern Africa, notably fabrics from Egypt and the Maghreb, and coral beads from Kuti on the Mediterranean coast. Therefore, the pattern of Western Sudanic and trans-Saharan commerce was integrating the resources of a wide area stretch from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. Long distance of trade across the Sahara had special characteristics. Some scholars have spoken of the camel as a ship of the Sahara. The towns in which the camel caravans entered on either side of the deserts were called, quote, ports. In practice, the trans-Sahara trade was a great achievement as crossing an ocean. What much more than local trade, it stimulated the famous cities of the region such as Walata, W-A-L-A-T, Timbuktu, Go, and Dajin, and it brought in the literate Islamic culture. Long distance trades strengthened state power, which meant in effect the power of the lineages who transformed themselves into a permanent aristocracy. However, it is a gross oversimplification of cause and effect to say that it was trans-Sahara trade which built Western Sudanic empires. This is a long one for Sudan. This is covering a lot. Ghana, Mali, and Sangha grew out of their environment and out of the efforts in their own population. And it was only after they achieved a certain status that the ruling classes could express an interest of long distance trade and could provide a security of permanent that trade to flourish. It is significant that the Western Sudan never provided any significant capital in the Trans-Sahara trade. The capital came from the merchants of Fez, Telmacine, and other cities of the Maghreb, and they sent other agents to reside in the Western Sudan. Thank you, Joe. To some extent, it was a colonial relationship because the exchange was unequal to North Africans' favor. However, the gold trade was at least capable of stimulating the development of the productive forces within Western Africa, while the accompanying trade in slaves had no such benefits. Ghana, Mali, and Senegal all exported small numbers of slaves, and the empire of Kanum Bornu gave slaves exports a much higher priority because it controlled no gold supplies. Kanum Bornu used its power to raid for captives to the south as far as Adamawa in modern Cameroon. I'm saying these names horribly, everybody. I'm sorry. The negative implications of such policies were to be fully brought out in later centuries when the steady trickles of slaves from few parts of West Africa across the Sahara was joined by the massive flow of the continent's peoples towards destinations named by Europeans. Though failing considerably short of a feudal state formation was more advanced in the Western Sudan than in most other parts of Africa in the periods 500 AD to 1500 AD. Apart from Ghana, Mali, Sanghay, and Kanum Bornu, there were outstanding kingdoms of, oh my gosh, here we go, Hassaland and Mosai in Senegal, and the Fotu Dajalin Mountains in Guinea, and in the basin of the Benue tributary of the river Niger. The Western Sudanic techniques of political organization and administration spread out to many neighboring regions and influenced the rise of innumerable small states scattered throughout the coastal regions from the river Senegal to the Cameroon Mountains. Some specific Sudanic features were discernible in many kingdoms, notably the position of the Queen Mother in political structures. This is a long one. This might be, because the next is Zimbabwe. All right, here we go. The strength and weaknesses of the Western Sudanic states attest to the point which they had reached on the long road away from communalism, with respect to social relations and to the level of production. The state held together several classes, social formations, and ethnic groups. In the case of Kanim Bornu, the pastoralists and cultivators were even able to integrate the camel nomads of the desert. Elsewhere, the Tuareg nomads were kept at bay so that cultivators and other sedentary people would live their lives in peace. Domestic beasts, and goods were free to move for thousands of miles in security. However, the state had not yet broken down the barriers between different social formations. The state exists as an institution which collected tribute from the various communities and restrained them from clashing. In periods of weakness, the superstructure and the state almost disappeared and left free scope for divisive political and social tendencies. Each successive great state was a further experiment to deal with the problem of unity, sometimes on the conscious level, and more often as an unconscious byproduct of the struggle for survival. Under feudalism, the ruling class in the state of the first time tore away the social institutions which prevented the first embryo state from exercising direct actions on each subject. That is to say, feudalism brought about the series of direct obligatory ties between landed rulers and landless subjects. In the Western Sudan, the clear-cut class division had not come into existence. By the time of Mali's preeminence in the 13th and 14th centuries, a small amount of local slavery had come into existence. And by the end of the 15th century, there were both chattel slaves and domestic slaves, quote unquote, comparable to feudal serfs. For instance, the Senegals and Portuguese traders found that there were elements in populations who worked most days for their masters and a few days per month for themselves. A budding feudalist tendency. Nevertheless, most of the population still had ample access to land through their kin, and in political terms that meant that the authority of the ruling class was exercised over heads of families and clans rather than over each subject. Although communal egalitarianism was on its way out, communal relations still persisted and had by the 15th century became a brake on the development of Western Sudan. Such surplus was being produced by the society above the subsistence needs came out of tribute from the collective communities rather than directly from the producers to the exploiting classes. That gave an incentive for maintaining the old social structures. Although they were incapable of increasing labor mobilization and specialization to a much greater degree, it was unlikely that there would be a violent social revolution. Under those circumstances, more advances of technology were required to spark off further changes. The degree of economic integration had not yet enhanced by greater productivity in various areas, allowing for more trade, more specialization in the division of labor, and the possibilities of surplus accumulation, but wheeled vehicles and the plow slopped in North Africa, and so too did large-scale irrigations. Indeed, through the crucial absence of large-scale irrigation, the productive base in the Western Sudan actually decreased, for the Sahara was advancing. Ghana had stood on fertile agricultural land, but both Mali and Songhai had their centers farther south because of former northern terrain of Ghana was claimed by the Sahara through dissection. Yeah, that's what it is. Techniques necessary for the control of this hostile environment and for the increase of agriculture and manufacturing capacity had either to evolve locally or to be brought in from outside. In the next phase of African history after the coming of the white man, both of those alternatives were virtually ruled out in West Africa. The interlacustrine zone. The higher levels of the social evolution of the Western Sudan has been the cause of lengthy debates as to whether the region had achieved feudalism on the European variety, or rather it should be classed together with the great Asian empires, or rather it created a new and unique category of its own. On the eastern side of the continent, development in the same period was definitely slower. For one thing, the people of Eastern Africa acquired iron tools at much later dates than their brothers in the north and west. And secondly, the range of their technology and skill was narrower. However, by the 14th century, state formations was well underway, and the principle of development revealed in the process were worth considering. An area of special interest is that of the Greater Lakes of Africa, and particularly the zone around the group of lakes which the British thought fit to rename in the honor of various members of British ruling families: Victoria, Albert, Edward, and George. In that inner clustering zone, several famous states eventually emerged, one of the earliest and largest being that of Bunyoro, I'm horrible, sorry, Katara. Bunyorio Katara, comprised in whole or in part of the regions which today are called Benerio, Acolio, Toro, Paraguay, and Bangada. I'm so sorry, buddy. All which fall in Uganda, except Karagwa, which is in Tanzania. Historical traditions have been orally preserved by these various peoples who at one time fell within the boundaries of Buriario Katara. Sorry. The traditions concentrate on ruling dynasties, which is known as the Bachwizi. The Bachwizi were supposedly an immigrant of pastoralist groups. They introduced long-horned humped cattle, which later became the major species in the inner Lacustrian zone. Possession of these cattle undoubtedly aided them to become a ruling aristocracy in the 14th and 15th centuries. They became a social stratum above the clans which previously existed and which had narrow territorial bases. The period of Bachwin's preeminence is also associated with ironworking and manufacturing of bark cloth and techniques of sinking well shafts through rocks, and most strikingly of all, the construction of extensive earthwork systems used apparently both for defense and for enclosing large herds of cattle. The largest of the earthwork was in Bangu, with ditches extending over 6.5 miles. The division of labor between the pastoralists and the cultivators and the nature of their contacts intensified the process of caste formation and class stratification in their interlacusting areas. The pastoralists of Bahima had imposed the rule over the cultivator, and the Baru social classes grew out of the situation of changing labor relations. The earthworks of Bingo, and elsewhere were not built by voluntary family labor, and some form of coercion must also have been used to get the cultivators to produce a surplus for their new lords. For instance, the Bakwizi are said to have established a system by which young men were conscripted into the king's service and were maintained by the Baru, who occupied and cultivated land assigned for the support of the army. They also introduced slave artisans and administrators. When administrative officials were appointed at the local level to rule on behalf of the aristocrats, that was the first step towards setting up feudal fiefs, as in Ethiopia. For a while, the question of land grants had not yet entered the picture. It must be borne in mind that inequality in the distribution of cattle meant, in fact, unequal access to the means of production. Oh, they got blocked. Interesting. All right, sounds good. Much uncertainty surrounds the precise identification of the Bakwizi. It is possible that they were not immigrants. Nevertheless, it is generally held that they were light complexioned pastoralists coming from the north. Assume that this was so. It was essential to stress that whatever was achieved in the interclastian regions in the 14th and 15th century was the product of the evolution of African society as a whole, and not a transplant from outside. In order to place those Eastern African events within the context of universal human achievement, a parallel can be drawn with India. Centuries before the birth of Christ, northern India was also a recipient of light complexed pastoral immigrants known as Aryans. There was a time when everything in India, Indian culture from India, was attributed to the Aryans, but then careful scrutiny revealed that the basis of Indian society and culture had been laid by earlier populations into the Dravidians. But therefore, it is now considered far more sensible to see the achievements of North India as a product of synthesis or combinations of Aryan and Dravidians. Dravidians, yeah. Similarly, in Eastern Africa, one needs to seek the elements of synthesis between the new and the old, and that, in effect, was the path of development in the interclastian zones and the 14th and 15th centuries. Let's see here. As has just been noted, the Bakwizi are associated with techniques such as ironworking and bark cloth manufacturing. It is not that all clearly established that they introduced such techniques for the first time, and it is much more probable that they presided over the elaboration of such skills. Certainly, iron-using societies were known in East Africa several centuries before Bakwizi period. Ngaraku, just south of the present Kenya Tanzanian border, there are to be found the ruins of a small but impressive Iron Age society which flourished sometime before the end of the first millennium AD, i.e. before 1000 AD. It goes, and Angaruka was a concentrated agricultural settlement engaging in tracing, irrigation, and constructions of walls by the technique known as dry stone building, whereby no time was required to hold the stones together. It was an interlacustrian area itself where there had emerged a banana-based agriculture, which was capable of supporting a large sedentary population. Sedentary. That was the sort of preconditions for moving from communal isolation to statehood. It is significant that orally preserved traditions apply in these existence these existence of kingdoms of Benurio and Karangua before the Bakwi. State formation was already in the embryo stage when the outsiders arrived, and the likelihood is that they did not remain outsiders for long. Like the Aryan in India, and the Bakwis did not even impose their own language, but adopted the Batu speech of the local inhabitants. That reflects the dominance of local rather than foreign elements in the synthesis. And in any event, the culture product was African and was part of the pattern of development through localized evolution, combined with the interplay of social formations on the continent-wide scale. Among the contributions supposedly made by the Bakwis to the interlacustrian kingdoms was the introduction of religion, based on the phases of the moon. In all of the situations examined so far, religion played a significant role in promoting the building of the state, leading away from the simple organization and the family community. Christianity and Islam have been most frequently associated with large-scale building, both inside and outside of Africa. That is to be explained not so much by the actual religious beliefs, but because memberships in the powerful universal church gave the ruling class of the young estates many advantages. A Christian or a Muslim prince had access to a literate culture and a wider world. He dealt with traders and craftsmen professing that religion. He used administrators and churchmen who were literate, and he could travel to parts of the world such as Mecca. Above all, the universal religion replaced, quote, traditional African ancestral religions in Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, and Maghreb, and progressively in Western Sudan, because Christianity and Islam were not rooted in any given family community, and therefore could not be used to mobilize the many communities that were merging into the state. However, religious beliefs, which had been accepted by a single clan or ethnic group, could be elevated to the same form or in a slightly altered form to become the religion of the whole state. This was the situation in the interlacustrian zone, and indeed in most other parts of Africa outside of the regions already described. Let's see how back this is Zimbabwe. Let's see how long it is, because I only got like less than 15 minutes. All right, let's one. I'm going to go a little bit over maybe. Let's find out. Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, one of the greatest constructions is brick, dated around the 14th century. Is commonly referred to as a, quote, temple, and is felt to have served religious purpose. Even from the scanty evidence, it is clear that the religious aspects of social development was of the greatest importance in serving to cement ties between individuals in the emergent African societies. For instance, the ruling class in the 15th century empire of Mutapa in Zimbabwe were pastoralists, and the religious rituals included objects that were symbolic of cattle, as was found in the interlacustrian kingdoms, such as Benurio and Karagwe. One can guess that the rituals also symbolized the dominance of the cattle owners, just as they also paid respect to pre-existing ideas or cultivators in order to effect and a stable synthesis. The details of the pictures are not available in the present stage of knowledge, but what is required is that the discussion of African regions must seek to present it in a mobile, revolutionary manner and to relate it to the changing socioeconomic forms of instructions. That task being beyond the confines of the present study, it is purposed to examine Zimbabwe as yet another region where the productive base and the political structures can be asserted to have developed appreciably in the last few centuries before Africa was drawn into contact with Europe. Within the southernmost sections of the continent, the area in which striking achievements were registered by the 15th century was that between the rivers of Zambezi and Limpopo, covering the territories that were later to be called Mozambique or Rhodesia. Iron using and state building peoples were active there from earlier in the first millennia AD. And eventually they emerged in the 14th century, the empire which Europeans called Monotopa. The term Zimbabwe, quote unquote, is being used here to designate the Zimbabwe Limpopo cultures in a few centuries preceding the European arrivals, because it was from the 11th to the 14th centuries that there flourished the society whose most characteristic features was the building of large stone palaces, known as collectively as Zimbabwe. Much has been written about the buildings which distinguish the Zimbabwe culture. They are a direct response to the environment of granite rocks, built upon granite hills or flanked granite. The most famous site of surviving stone ruins is that of Great Zimbabwe, north of the river Sambai. Sambai. Okay. One of the principal structures in Great Zimbabwe was some 300 foot long and 220 foot broad, with the walls being 30 feet high and 20 feet thick. The technique of laying the bricks, I gotta let the cat out real quick, everybody. They're meowing like wild. Hold on. There we go. All right, let me read this again. Sorry, everybody. 30 feet wrong. One of the techniques of laying the brick, on the other hand, without time to act as a cement, was the same style noted in the description of Irgurek in northern Tanzania. It was in the fact in a peculiar aspect of the material culture of Africa being widely found in Ethiopia and Sudan. The style of the encircling brick walls in Great Zambia and other sites was also characteristically African in what it was an elaboration of the mud enclosure or kraals of many Batin-speaking people. One European archaeologist is reported to have said that there was as much labor expended in Zimbabwe as on the pyramids of Egypt. That is surely an overestimate, for the pyramids were raised through the incredible amount of slave labor which could not possibly have been at the disposal of the rulers of Zimbabwe. However, it is definitely necessary to reflect on the amount of labor which would have been required to construct the buildings within the Zimbabwe regions up until the 15th century. Their workers may well have been from particular ethnic groups who were subjugated by other ethnic groups. But the process of subjugation, they were acquiring the character of a social class whose labor was being exploited, nor was it sheer manual labor. Skills, creativities, and artistry went into the construction of the walls, especially with regard to the decorations and the inner recesses of the doors. When Cecil Rhodes sent in his agents to rob and steal in Zimbabwe, they and other Europeans marveled at the surviving ruins of Zimbabwe culture and automatically assumed that it had been built by white people. Of course they did. Even today, there is still a tendency to consider the achievements within the sense of wonder rather than with the claim acceptance that it was a perfectly logical outgrowth of human social development within Africa, as part of the universal process by which man's labor opened up new horizons. The sense of reality can only be restored by making it clear that the architectural rested on the foundation of advanced culture, agriculture, and mining, which had come into existence over centuries of evolution. Zimbabwe was a zone of mixed farming, with cattle being very important since the area is free from tsetse flies. Irrigation and terracing reached considerable proportions. There was no single darn, D-A-R-N, and aqueduct comparable to those in Asia or ancient Rome. But countless small streams were diverted and made to flow around the hills in a manner that indicated an awareness of a scientific principle governing the motion of water. In effect, the people of Zimbabwe had produced hydrolysis through their understanding of the material environment. On the mining side, it was equally striking that the African peoples in the zone in question had produced prospectors and geologists, quote unquote, who had a clear idea of where to look for gold and copper in the subsoil. When the European colonialists arrived in the 19th century, they found that virtually all the gold-bearing and copper-bearing strata had been mined previously by Africans. Although, of course, not on the same scale as Europeans were to achieve with drilling equipment. Among the Zimbabwe people, there also arose craftsmen who worked the gold into ornaments with tremendous skills and lightness of touch. The presence of gold, in particular, was a stimulus of an external trade. And in turn, it was external demand which did most to accelerate mining. In the first millennia AD, there was gold using aristocracy at Ngombe Hadi, just north of Zimbabwe. Presumably, they got their supplies from gold mines farther south. However, gold is acquired in large quantities only in the societies which produce a very large economic surplus and can afford to transform part of what surplus into gold for prestige purposes, as in India, or into coinage and money to promote capitalism, as in Western Europe. The pre-feudal African societies did not have such a surplus, nor the social relations which made it necessary for gold to circulate a great deal internally. Hence, it was the presence of the Arabic traders as far south as Sofala in the Mozambique Channel, which spurred Zimbabwe to mine more gold for export. Just about the same time in the 11th century, when stone building was beginning, The implication is that the number of factors coincide, namely the intensification of class stratification, of state consolidation, of production and building techniques, and the trade. Several different ethnic groups contributed to Zimbabwean society. The earliest population of the region were the Bushmen, quote unquote, the Koshan type of hunters who today were found only in small numbers of southern South Africa. They were incorporated into the physical stock of newcomers from further north speaking Bantu languages. And in fact, they made their contribution to the Bantu language of the area. Among the Bantu speakers, there were also several different groups coming into their own at different times. The material evidence which has been revealed by archaeologists shows various pottery styles, contrasting burial positions, and different hewn structures among skeletons. Other material artifacts show that, like Islam, that over the centuries, many societies occupied the regions of Zimbabwe. Much of the interpenetration of one group by another was done peacefully, although at the same time, the very existence of the fortified hilltops and stone defenses shows that the largest states were engaged in military struggles for several and preeminence. Furthermore, some ethnic groups must have been permanently regulated to inferior status, so as to provide the labor for agriculture, building, and mining. Other clans specialized in pastoralism, warfare, and control over religious apparatus, such as the divination and rainmaking. It is believed that the inhabitants of Zimbabwe in the 11th and to the 14th century were Sotho speaking, Sotho. But by the time the Portuguese arrived, the Shono speaking dynasty had taken control of most of the region. That was the Razui clan, which set up the state of Matapa between Zambezi and the Limpopo. The ruler was known as, Mwani Matupa, which apparently meant the great lord of Matupa to his own followers, but was held to mean, quote, the great pillager. Oh my gosh. By peoples whom he conquered and wielded together into a single empire. The first individual to hold the titles, Mwini Matupa, ruled from about 1415 to 1450, but the dynasty had already been growing prominent before that date. The capital was at first sited at Great Zimbabwe. The later moved north. It was important was that the Mwini, I can't do this, Mwini Matupu appointed governors to rule over various localities outside of the capital in the manner comparable to that of Western Sudanic empires or the Indo-Cuscan Bakwizi state. The Razui lords of Matupa did most to encourage production for export trade, notably in gold, ivory, and copper. Arabic merchants came to reside in the kingdom of, and the Zimbabwe region became involved in the network of Indian Ocean commerce, which linked them with India, Indonesia, and China. One of the principal achievements of the Razui lords of Matupa was to organize a single system of production and trade. They extracted tribute from the various communities in their kingdoms, which was both a sign of sovereignty and a form of trade because the movement of goods was stimulated. Yeah. There is no doubt that the foreign trade strengthened the Matupa state, but above all, it strengthened the ruling strata, which had a monopoly over the aspects of economic activity. In comparison with other African elites at that time, the Razui and of Zimbabwe still had a long way to go. They were not in the same category as the Amharic nobility of Ethiopia or the Arabic Berbers, feudal lords of the Maghreb. They did imbibed a few influences from outside, but they did not travel as did the rulers of Mali and Songhai, who made a pilgrimage to Mecca. Their dress was still mainly animal skin, and such cloth was as they utilized were recent imports from the Arabic traders rather than the products of the evolution of their own skills in that field. In that respect, Zimbabwe also trailed behind other early African states such as Oyo and Yorubaland, Benin, and in the same area, and the 14th century Kingdom of Congo, which Europeans refer to as the greatest state in Western Africa at the time of their arrival. It has been considered necessary for the purpose of illustration to consider some, through by no means all, of the outstanding areas of development in Africa before the coming of the Europeans. Nor should it be forgotten that there were innumerable village communities emerging to become states, that there were small in size, but were sometimes sharply stratified internally and displayed an impressive level of material advance. Those described above should be sufficient to establish that Africa in the 15th century was not just a jubile of different quote-unquote tribes. There was a pattern, and there was historical movement. Societies such as feudal Ethiopia, Egypt, were at the furthest point of the process of evolutionary development. Zimbabwe and Bakwizi states were also clearly on the ascendant away from communalism, but at the lower level than the feudal states and the few others that were not yet feudal, such as those in Western Sudan. Page and a half to go. 2 more pages and then we'll be done. Conclusion. In introducing the concepts of development, attention was drawn to the fact that the slow, imperceptible expansion in social productive capacity ultimately amounts to the qualitative differences, with the arrival at the new stage sometimes being announced by social violence. It can be said that most African societies had not reached a new stage that was remarkably different from communalism, and hence the use in this study of the cautious term, quote, transitional, end quote. It can also be noted that nowhere had there been any internal social revolutions. The latter have taken place in European and world history only where class consciousness led to a massive intervention of people's wills within the otherwise involuntary socio-economic process. Such observations help to situate African development up to the 15th century at the level that was below mature, class-ridden feudalism. It should also be reiterated that slavery was a mode of production, as not present in any African society, although some slaves were to be found where the decomposition of communal equality had gone farthest. This is an outstanding feature illustrating the autonomy of the African path within the broader framework of universal advance. One of the paradoxes in studies this early period of African history is that it cannot be fully comprehended without first deepening our knowledge of the world at large. And yet, a true picture of the complexities of the development of man and society can only be drawn after intensive studies of long neglected African continent. There is no escaping the use of comparison as the aid to clarity, and indeed, the parallels have been narrowly restricted to Europe, even though they could also be provided by examples from Asian history. Therein lies the cultural imperialism, which makes it easier for the European educated African to recall names like French, Capetans, and the Prussian, I can't say this word, Hohenzollern's, can't say that, rather than the Vietnamese dynasty of Id and Tran. For the latter are either unknown to him or would be considered unimportant if known, or might even be judged too difficult to pronounce. Several historians of Africa have pointed out that after surveying the developed areas of the continent in the 15th century and those within Europe at the same date, the difference between the two was in no way to African discredit. Indeed, the first Europeans to reach West and East Africa by sea were the ones who indicated that in most respect, African development was comparable to that which they knew. To take but one example, when the Dutch visited the city of Benin, they described it thus. So here's them describing it. The town seems to be very great. When you enter into it, you go into a great broad streets, not paved, which seem to be seem to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Worms streets in Amsterdam. The King's Palace is a collection of buildings which occupy as much space as the town of Haarlem, and which is enclosed with walls. There are numerous apartments for the princes and ministers, and fine galleries, most of which are as big as those on the exchange at Amsterdam. They are supported by wooden pillars encased with copper. There were victories are depicted and which are carefully kept very clean. The town is composed of 30 main streets, very straight and 120 feet wide. Apart from the infinity of small intersecting streets, the houses are close to one another, arranged in good order. These people are in no way inferior to the Dutch as regards cleanliness. They wash and scrub their houses so well that they are polished and shining like a looking glass. Yet, okay, that's the end of that one. And in the last paragraph, here we go, closing it up. Yet it would be self-delusions to imagine that all things were exactly equal in Benin and in Holland. European society was already more aggressive, more expansionist, and more dynamic in producing new forms. The dynamism within Europe was contained within the merchant and manufacturing class. In the galleries of the exchange at Amsterdam sat Dutch burghers, the ancestors of the modern bourgeoisie of the industry and finance, with class of 15th. This class in 15th century Europe was able to push the feudal landowners forward or aside. They began to discard conservatism and to create an intellectual climate in which change was seen as desirable. A spirit of innovation arose in technology. The transformation of the mode of production was quickened. When Europe and Africa established close relations through trade, there was therefore already a slight edge on Europe's favor. An edge representing the difference between a fledgling capitalist society and one that is still emerging from communalism. And that's the end of that chapter. Next chapter is chapter 3. Africans' contributions to European capitalist development, the period of pre-colonial period. And that is page 85. Chapter 3, 85. So basically they went over to prove the fact that Africa was developing just fine without European intervention. They had trade routes, they had economies, they had relations, they had social relations, they had class stratifications, they had buildings, they had agriculture, culture, all that riched. They even went into different places to have relationships. So they were on a developmental path and stuff before contact with Europe's. And all he did is he went through the histories of some of these areas to prove the fact of them developing states and developing away from communalism and stuff. So yeah, I think he does a really good job on that section to go through the historical materialism of Africa, even though it's a bit brief, but still it should drive the point that they were in the stages of development, and they probably would have developed further and faster, in my opinion, if like, yeah. What's up? I don't understand. I don't know why you did that. Okay. Anyways, I'm going to stop here. It's time to go feed the Rufus. But I'll be back tomorrow. And we'll go over, what are we going over? Let me look. Pre-colonial period. We're gonna go over how Europe became a dominant section in the world trade system. I think they're gonna go over what Europe went through and how it became a power and how they utilized that power in the seas and stuff. African contribution to, okay. So we'll be hitting up some different sections on here. Not a long section, honestly. Might be able to finish the root, and then the chapter 4 will be Europe and the roots of African underdevelopment in 1885. So yeah, it will be fun. All right, I don't know why you tagged them, Joe, but oh well, no big deal. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening. If you stuck around, if not, that's understandable. It's kind of not always fun to stick around and stuff sometimes, but I appreciate everybody. I wish you all well. Page, I thought I gave you the page already. I said it. 85. Chapter 3. Oh, wait. Chapter 3, 85. Yep. All right, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your night.